Just thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak with you today. I'm going to start by, well, first of all, just to give you a background as to the kind of work and research that I do. My work is really in the intersection between creativity, aesthetics, and the arts, right? So I'm a psychologist of art. I'm going to begin by talking about two friends, actually. And so one friend is an art historian from Vienna. And he believes that when an artist is finished with an artwork, so he or she's finished with a sculpture or a painting, that whatever the artist thinks and how that artist thinks about the artwork is kind of independent and should be independent of how the aesthetic process happens. So the artist's thoughts should not have anything to do with what happens later on when somebody's actually experiencing and engaging with the artwork that that artist created, right? A very extreme perspective. My other buddy, who's actually a mentor, believes that it's the almost extreme opposite of the first person. He believes that when an artist is creating an artwork, he or she does not think about the viewer, that he or she does not think about the potential perceiver of that artwork. So two very different perspectives, two very extreme perspectives. One believes that creativity is independent of the aesthetic process, and the other believes the opposite, that the aesthetic process should be independent of the creative process. They're still really good friends, even though they're very extreme. And one thing that I'll talk about today is that those two perspectives really represent how the fields of creativity and aesthetics take place, how we do research in creativity and aesthetics. One thing that I'll talk about today is that there's a very creativity and aesthetics are quite related, right? If we look at it in practice. So, for example, an artist does think about, and I'm going to try to convince you today, if that's not what you believe, does think about the audience as much as all other creators. The composer or the musician writing music thinks about the listeners or whoever is going to be in the concert. The writer will think about, fiction writer, for example, will think about the readers of whatever product they come up with. The chef thinks about the patrons, whoever visits the restaurant. And certainly, the architect thinks about the potential residents of this house. But the architect was not thinking of kids in this example. Certainly, if you have kids, it's like, what a disaster waiting to happen. I have two, so I like to think about creativity aesthetics as being a conversation. And I'm going to give you examples of how that really happens, right? I think it's unnatural to think of creativity independent of aesthetics. And I think vice versa, if you think that aesthetics is independent of creativity, it's natural because in reality, a lot of what people create is experienced by someone else at a future time. That future time might be way later, it could be years later, or it could be immediately, right after creation. But that is a conversation that takes place. And I'm going to give you some examples in the history of art of how this happens. So anybody familiar with Escher's work? All right. So if you've seen these, they're really visual illusions, right? Escher played around with this idea of this figure ground sort of a concept and capacity that we have. So for example, if I'm standing here, you can separate me, hopefully, from the pedestal, right? It's because I'm being blocked by that. So figure ground, we do it naturally. We know what's in the front and we know what's in the back. But Escher plays around with this, and not just in this piece, but many other pieces where you're really confused. So if you first look at this, and it gets easier the longer we look at it, is that a bird or is that the farm field, right? And there's also, he has one with ocean versus fish and sky and fish and so forth. So Escher had to think about how people who's going to look at the artworks actually process information visually. We have this peak shift effect as well. So when we do certain things like manipulate, in caricatures, we manipulate some of the characteristics of, for example, Jay Leno, right? Has a lot of characters about his chin. So an artist would even make that, make it even bigger to emphasize it. We have Ansel Adams. Are you familiar with Ansel Adams' work? Ansel Adams knew very well how people actually looked at images. So the darks and the lights in a lot of Ansel Adams' pictures are very extreme. So he's able to capture, pull apart the lightness and the darkness. He also looked at this as a performance, right? He said that, I think of the negative, we rarely have negatives these days. I think of the negative as the score and the print as the performance of that score, which conveys the emotional and aesthetic ideas of the photographer at the time of making the exposure. So he takes a picture, comes up with a negative, but then that doesn't end there, right? It's the print from that negative that is the final performance. Almost like Calder, so I learned that yesterday. Calder thought of some things as the score, and then whoever executes his ideas as sort of like the performance. We have Chuck Close as well. And if you've ever seen a Chuck Close painting, from up close, they're grids, right, filled in with colors. But as you move back and you know what happens, then you get to see what the actual image is. And a lot of this, he did a lot of self-portraits. So that's artists thinking about the viewer, right? So that's one of the reasons I find it very difficult when somebody has an extreme position that the artist does not think about the viewer, that the artist only thinks about the concept and what he or she would like to express. So over the years, a lot of my research is in trying to figure out ways to combine, to actually integrate creativity and aesthetics. And my efforts, I sum up in this one fairly simple statement, where the creative process ends, the aesthetic experience begins. So I tried to look at all the models that exist that describe the aesthetic experience. And some of my colleagues later, Chatterjee, Paul Locker, actually Oshin has a model, but they all have something in common. One of the things they have in common is the process from when you first look at an artwork to when you actually make an interpretation of that artwork. And it happens very quickly. So a quick question for you. Imagine yourself watching people in a museum like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, massive, famous museum, or the Art Institute of Chicago. And imagine you're watching people looking at masterpieces, right, by Raphael, Michelangelo, Rembrandt. How long do you think the average time is of interaction? How long do people look at these, let's say, paintings? How many would say 2 minutes? Hands up. Okay. How many would say 1 minute? How many would say 30 seconds? All right. You're right. The average is 27.2 seconds. Okay. So my colleagues Jeff and Lisa Smith did a study in 2001, 27.2 seconds at the Metropolitan Museum. We replicated this study at the Art Institute of Chicago in 2017, and it's right about 27 seconds. All right? So it's incredible how this happens. But what we do during that time is we first look at the surface of the painting, and we make determinations and evaluations based on things like symmetry and color. The second is we look at what is being painted, all right? What's in that scene? What is the sculpture? So we identify the object and the things, landscapes that are in that painting or whatever artwork it is. And in the end, what we do is we ask questions. I wonder what the artist was thinking about, right? I wonder what the purpose of this work is. I wonder if he is like political or he is an activist. I wonder what the message being conveyed is, right? Or the emotions being conveyed. So this we agree on as what happens cognitively, more or less. All right, so there's details regarding this, but I'm kind of oversimplifying it. So what I did was try to combine this with the creative process. And what we found through different folks conducting different research using different methodology is that the art making process begins, let's say, I'm going to use painting as an example, but it's very similar if it's architecture, let's say. We begin with sketching. So outlining what it is that you want to put down, what it is that you want to paint. Sculptors do the same thing. What do they want to take away, all right? Then we expand on that. We basically build layers. So if it's a painting, you start sketching even more. You start adding a little bit of color, you start making the lines thicker, you start building on the layers, and then in the end, the finalizing process is when you add the color in the end, you maybe put a varnish to protect the surface of the painting, and so on. The aesthetic experience is the opposite of this, right? So essentially, if we first encounter an artwork, our first encounter is the last step that the artist actually took. And then we go backwards. So now we try to figure out what is being shown, what is depicted, what is being painted, and in the end, we make a judgment. Do I like this? Do I not like this? What emotions does it make me feel? What sort of concept did the artist want to communicate or express in this painting? So the mirror model is that there's a mirror reverse relationship between the creative process, here I'm talking about artworks, and then the aesthetic process as well. So how does that play out? We have correspondences in these, right? So we wanted to look at, is there some way that there's that emotions, and this is where the emotions come in, transfer from the artwork to the viewer, right? It's a question that we kind of wonder about, but we never really tested it scientifically, and that's really what we wanted to do. So I call something a curatorial paradox, and I'm going to tell you a conversation that I had before actually doing this study. I was talking with, right now is actually a head of a museum. She used to be the head of education at a museum in New York. So I was talking about running a study, and my suggestion was we take labels, we change them, we write our own labels, right? And then we run the study. We give people different labels. And she said, "You're crazy." So why? You just change the label. She's like, "The curators will kill me." She says, "We're lucky they even allow us to put labels next to the artwork." And I was so confused. This was many years ago. I said, "Explain, I don't get it." She said, "Well, curators believe that each person, each viewer has a very unique response to the artwork, a very unique reaction to what it is they're looking at. As soon as you put a label, you're kind of suggesting a way, an approach to looking at the artwork, right?" And for me, that was, as a scientist studying visual perception and aesthetics, that was odd, because if you're looking at the same artwork, shouldn't you be getting the same responses from people? But it wasn't really tested at that time, especially with regards to emotions. So a note about emotions. We talk about emotions all the time. We're going to talk about emotions all week actually, until Friday. But it's probably one of the least understood part as far as experiencing and interacting with artworks. We really don't know that much yet, and we're kind of getting there. So we wanted to test this out. This correspondence, this sort of jump of emotion from artwork, right, to the viewer. So 3 questions that we ask. One is, when you look at an artwork or you go into an exhibition, what emotions do you feel? And how strong are those emotions? Second, is there some sort of correspondence between what an artwork is supposed to do to us emotionally and what the actual viewer is experiencing, right? The feelings that they have after interacting with their artwork. And the third, and it's an important question, this is sort of the curatorial paradox. Would people agree as to what emotions they'll experience? If folks are right, the first group where they say, oh, it's everyone experiences it differently, then there should be no shared emotions. It should all be different. So you're going to experience happiness, sadness, right? Nostalgia, and so forth. So we wanted to test these things out. 2 exhibitions we looked at. We also looked at artworks. I'll speak about those later. One is an exhibition that presented like the museum's collection, old stuff. Typically quite somber, all right? Eva Hesse, for example. This is A.A. Bronson's painting of his partner dying of AIDS, all right? His partner's on his deathbed, essentially. So a little bit quiet, a little bit subdued, a little bit formal. The other exhibition is completely different. It was playful. Video games. You can do bowling, all right? Like a video game type bowling. Things were moving around. These things here are spinning. So the emotional characteristics of the 2 exhibitions could not be more different. One is super playful, super positive, and the other quite somber. So what we did was we took Scherer's, this is called the emotion wheel. And what you get to choose the family of emotion that you are actually feeling. And you can also choose how intense those emotions are. So the farther you go out into the periphery, the stronger the emotion. And you can also choose to say that I'm feeling nothing at all, which is actually quite unusual for that. So we had visitors fill this out right after they looked at an artwork or after they exited an exhibition. And these are the results. Should I stop here? No. So I can't present this, right? It's like, what do we do now? All right, how do we present this information? It's a whole lot of good information, right? So we looked at the dominant emotion that people reported and the strongest, kind of most intense emotions. So we took this and mapped it into a field of emotions. And we wanted to be able to account for or figure out what they chose, what they said that they felt, and how strong it is, and also how many people felt the same emotions. And then we did this, all right? So it's called an emotional heat map. The hotter it is, the more people agreed regarding that emotion, and also the more intense the emotions that were reported. So we combine those. It's a qualitative and quantitative approach. So this is the first exhibit, very formal, quite somber. A lot of people showed involvement and interest, enjoyment, pleasure, but look at this: astonishment, surprise, longing, nostalgia, pity, compassion, and a touch of sadness and despair. Okay? Now, start thinking about the other exhibition. What do you think will happen? Okay? So we have involvement and interest, which we like, from a museum's perspective, right? But we also have amusement and laughter, enjoyment and pleasure. And if you look at the two side by side, they do represent the emotional characteristics of the exhibitions. We did the same thing with individual artworks. So I'm going to show you three right now. George O'Keeffe's Ladder to the Moon. Grosvenor's, this is a really cool sculpture. It's attached to the ceiling. It looks like it's a gazillion pounds. And if you go close to it, it looks like it's about to fall. And it looks like it's moving. People kind of find it interesting. Kids love it. And then we have A.A. Bronson's, the same one I talked to you about earlier. So now you could see how the things kind of diverge, right? The emotions. With A.A. Bronson, sadness and pity, compassion are the two most dominant families of emotions. We look at Grosvenor, wonderment and feeling awe. So it's kind of hard to argue. Like, that's really what it is. And the writings from the curators, the writings from the booklets and the brochures also support this. And then O'Keeffe, she actually writes about nostalgia regarding this art piece, and that was captured in the viewers' responses. So these conversations, we sort of operationally defined, means scientifically we wanted to look at them, try to figure out a way to observe them. And we observed them through these correspondences between the artwork, emotional characteristics, and the viewer's sort of feelings after having experienced the artwork or the exhibitions. So for me, that's one sort of conversation that we're having. And that's only emotional. There's also the cognitive, right? And there's also the ones that are not feelings, things we cannot really talk about readily. So what's the implications of this? Is that one, art is a conversation. And for all of us I work in a lot of museums because I do research in them. One of the things that museum folks don't do enough, and I try to convince them, is that there's a lot of knowledge. There's a lot of things we know that you could actually use to engage the visitors and so forth. One of the big things about art over the years I've learned is that it's kind of like a way to flex us. So we walk into a museum, we might be so stressed out because of the drive. For me, it's like taking the subway to the Met. It's a complete stressful situation, right? I don't even know why, but it's always stressful. So I walk in there, I'm super stressed, right? And then I get into a gallery, and it's like, wow, I'm kind of cognitively, my thinking is slowed down, and I'm able to think about in ways that I normally wouldn't if I'm outside the museum. And emotionally, that's the same thing as well. And then, we have to start thinking about bridging that gap between creativity and aesthetics. And I think that's one of the things that we can all do, right? As regardless of any situation, is that the creation and the reception naturally are very much integrated, and we tend to forget that. I think that's all I have for you. Thank you very much. I'll set your timer.
I guess it's time for me to start then. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to be here. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Oshin Vartanian. I'm basically a psychologist who does work in cognitive neuroscience. My initial plan for today was to actually talk about the neuroscience of both creativity and aesthetics, but I've purposefully left out any kind of discussion of aesthetics so you'd have some kind of a motivation to invite me back next year. Okay, so what I'm going to do today basically is the field of neuroscience of creativity is still... Better? Okay. So the field of neuroscience of creativity is still relatively young. I think in its modern phase, it's sort of been around for about 20 years now. So what I would like to do is I'd like to kind of give you a history of where the field is right now to kind of like walk you through its development over the last 20 years. If you sort of look at the field right now, we seem to have gone through 3 different stages. There was kind of the early phase that has to do mostly with brain mapping. So a lot of the work in the first maybe 10 or 15 years had to do with trying to see whether there was some kind of a brain region in the brain that was involved in generation of creative ideas. That was kind of the early Act 1 phase. The second phase, where things got a lot more interesting, was that we actually began doing some very interesting work on ecologically valid studies of creativity. Now, of course, it's kind of arguable whether the fMRI scanner is an ecologically valid environment for studying creativity. I tend to find a very aesthetic object, but there's certain things that you can and cannot do inside the fMRI scanner environment. But I think we've kind of made vast advances compared to about 20 years ago in terms of what we can do today. Finally, I want to talk about some of the really exciting work happening right now, which has to do with a systems-based approach to looking at what's happening in the brain. So we're no longer really concerned about specific regions doing specific things, but we're looking at the interactions between large-scale networks in the brain and how they support and bring about creativity. And I want to end by probably, I think, a very, very new series of studies that have come out right now that have kind of looked at what's happening in the brain of people that are considered to be highly creative. So pretty much everything that I'll be talking about today mostly comes from studies of psychology undergraduates, with some artists tossed in for good measure. But last couple of years, people have actually begun looking at some people who are bona fide creative experts in their own fields. And then it's really kind of interesting to see whether at the level of the brain, there's something really special happening amongst experts. Okay. So I want to talk about a really basic task that a lot of us kind of use in the fMRI scanner in case you're not really familiar with the literature. This is called the alternate uses task. The way it sort of works is that you go into the fMRI scanner and you're given names of different kinds of objects. For example, an umbrella. Okay? And you're given a certain amount of time to think about creative uses for an umbrella. Okay? So you can think about some of the regular uses, some of the more creative things one can do with an umbrella. And while you're thinking about various kinds of uses inside the fMRI scanner, we're trying to see what's happening at the level of the brain. Because what we can then do is we can distinguish participants who are more and less creative to see whether something at the level of the brain distinguishes creative from less creative responses. Okay? It's not a particularly colorful task, but it's kind of like a bread and butter component of our toolkit. So in the early phase of studies on the neuroscience of creativity, a lot of studies relied on very simple tasks like these. Now, about 2013, which would be about maybe 10 or 15 years into this field, there were already a large number of studies that were available that looked at this very simple design to look at some really simple components of what we call divergent thinking. So a very important paper was published around 2013, which did what's called a meta-analysis. Okay? So what a meta-analysis will do is that, as you can imagine, there was probably a lot of variety in the results that were coming up from different kinds of studies in this area. What a meta-analysis will do is that it sort of combines all the results from all of these different studies to see whether there's any kind of reliable and robust activation in the brain that's consistent across studies. Okay? So there's going to be a lot of esoteric differences. We don't really care about those. We care about reliable results. So this particular meta-analysis combined 34 different studies, over 600 subjects, to look to see at the level of the brain, what are the regions that support creativity. And this is the image that showed up. So you look at this, and at first glance, it looks like the entire brain is involved in creativity, okay? And it shows you how much consistency there must have been across all of these different studies to generate this kind of a model. But it's a very superficial picture of what's going on, because what's more interesting is to look to see whether the brain activations differ as a function of what the person is actually doing. So there's lots of different ways to cut this data, okay? And one of the easy ways to cut this data would be to cut it along whether the tasks that people are engaged in are verbal tasks or non-verbal tasks, okay? And you see there's immediately a difference in terms of the patterns that emerge at the level of the brain. So when a person is engaged in a verbal task, like the one that I just talked about earlier, the alternative uses task, you get robust activation in regions of the brain that underlie linguistic processing, so the temporal lobes and the inferior frontal gyrus. On the other hand, if the task that you're doing involves visual spatial creativity, the activation shifts to the parietal lobes. Okay? So even superficially at the level of the global level, everything looks activated. Once you cut it along different axes, you can see dissociations. A very similar difference emerges when you, for example, look to see whether a task is a combination task or a generation task. Okay, so a generation task would be something where you're told to, for example, generate novel responses. That's a generation task. A combination task would be, I give you different kinds of objects, you're supposed to combine them to produce a novel response. So when you look at combination tasks, that's what you see in blue, you see significant activation in the very frontal regions of the brain called the rostral prefrontal area. And what that region of the brain does is it does what's called relational integration. That means if I give you two different concepts, you kind of have to realign them to see how you can actually put them together. Okay? So the actual process makes a difference in terms of what brain regions are engaged. So if you review the first brain mapping act, so this would be maybe the first 10 or 15 years of the field, a couple of basic findings you can conclude. One of them is that at the level of the brain, the architecture is process specific. In other words, if you're looking at something like verbal versus nonverbal processing, if you're looking at something like generation versus combination, the regions of the brain that are involved differ. Okay? So you can also think about this in terms of domain specificity. Okay? Another thing that's also very clear from the early brain results is that the architecture of creativity at the level of the brain is componential. Okay? So every single region contributes something very specific to creative production, be it, for example, attention or memory or executive functions. So together, the constellation is what brings about creativity at the level of the brain. Okay? Now, Act 2 is where things got a bit more interesting. So we did all of the divergent thinking studies we could do, and then there was not much left to do. So people had to look at new paradigms, okay? And people came up with some very interesting ideas. There's lots of studies to actually review for this phase. I'm going to talk about a couple of them that I think are particularly exciting. So there was a very important study that was published in 2012 coming from University of British Columbia in Vancouver that had to do with creative drawing inside the fMRI scanner. Okay? So we have a device that you can see up there. It's called an MRI-compatible tablet that you can take inside the MRI scanner. And what a person can do in the MRI-compatible tablet is they can do different kinds of production tasks, like, for example, drawing. And what you can do is you can generate real-time movies of the brain that are correlated with what the person is actually doing. Okay? For this particular task, they took students from the, at least in Canada, famous Emily Carr School of Art and Design. So they were really, really good at designing things. They were put into the fMRI scanner, and the task was very cool. They were shown verbal descriptions of different kinds of books, okay? And their idea was to generate book covers that would capture the gist of the book. Okay? So the person went into the scanner, the description came up, they actually sketched a book cover, and then they stopped sketching. And the second phase had to do with evaluating to see if what they'd done was actually any good. So there was a generation phase followed by an evaluation phase. Okay, so let's see what they found. Okay, so what you see in the upper row is what's happening in the brain when a person is involved in generating a book cover. Okay? And the regions that are activated in the upper row correspond very precisely to the default mode network. It's a very well-known network at the level of the brain. And what the default mode network will do is it becomes activated when you're involved in self-generated cognition. Okay? So most of what you do in your everyday life is responding to stimuli coming in from the outside. When you're doing that, the default mode network is suppressed. Okay? But when you're mind wandering or dreaming, this is when it kicks in. Okay? So the idea here is that when a person is actually generating novel ideas, the default mode network comes in because the person is using internally oriented cognition to come up with novelty. Okay? What you see in the bottom row is what's referred to as the executive control network. And what the executive control network will do is it's involved in planned behavior. So if you're judging the quality of things, that's when the executive control network kicks in. So in other words, when a person is generating a book cover, it's a default mode network because they're involved in ideation. But when they're evaluating what they've done, it's the executive control network. There's a very interesting back and forth between these two networks in the process of generating novel book covers. The next study that was done, which I think also is a very, very interesting one from this era, had to do with jazz improvisation. So I see some smiles in the crowd. I'm not the only jazz fan here. This is a really great study. So for this particular study, they recruited participants who were, of course, professional musicians. Okay. In particular, they were jazz musicians who could improvise. Okay. They also came up with an MRI-compatible keyboard. They're very hard to find and very expensive, but I've touched one before. So what you do is, so they had people go home and they studied various kinds of variations in jazz, and then they came back to the fMRI scanner, and there were basically two important conditions. In one important condition, they were played a particular variation and they replicated it. Okay? It's just brute copying. Okay? In the other one, an accompaniment was presented to them and they were allowed to freely improvise in the fMRI scanner. Okay? So it's one of the very, very first studies that we have of ecologically valid musical production inside the fMRI scanner. And what they found, this is for anyone who can actually read notation, is a very interesting pattern. So what they found is that what's happening when a person is improvising, there is a suppression of the executive control network. So if you remember what I talked about earlier, the executive control network kicks in when you're evaluating the quality of what it is that you've done. It's quite beautiful that when the person is improvising, there's a deactivation of those regions, so the person is actually allowed to ideate. Okay? Another thing that you can see is greater activation in the default mode network, which, if you remember, I talked about a few minutes earlier, which is the region that kicks in when a person is involved in self-generated ideas. In other words, the brain regions that you see in support of creative jazz improvisation perfectly make sense from a psychological perspective. Okay? So the basic take-home message from the second phase of studies, which is what I've called Act 2, is that we kind of have two different systems at the level of the brain contributing to creative ideation. There's a default mode network that kicks in when a person is generating novel ideas, and there is the executive control network that kicks in when you come in to actually evaluate the products of what it is that you've done. Okay? Now we have entered what I like to refer to as our Act 3. So a lot of early work in neuroscience had to do with brain mapping, looking at specific structures, doing very specific things, but now we can do analysis at the level of networks, okay? And what I mean by that is we now know that at the level of the brain, there are essentially 7 large-scale networks that do different types of things, okay? So I've shown a very nice picture from Dasha Zabalina's paper from a few years ago. You can, for example, see at the bottom the default mode network that I've already talked about and the executive control network, and there are others, for example, areas that look after vision, areas that look after attention, and typically when you see activations, you don't see them in a particular area alone, but it's in a network, okay? A lot of the early work wasn't able to show networks because of the methods of analysis that we had, but now because we're doing things at the systems level, we can really extract them. Okay? And what you can see at the heat map there is the extent to which activation in one network is correlated with a different network. Okay? As you can see, a lot of them tend to be anti-correlated. Okay? So in other words, when one network is on, other networks tend to be off. which of course makes sense. Okay? Now, this is a very nice study that was done by Roger Beatty that probably will be familiar to you if you're following the work on neuroscience of creativity. He's done some really fantastic work last few years. So this is basically an image of the brain. These are areas of the brain that are co-activated when the person is engaged in divergent thinking. Okay? So if you remember, it mimics very closely an image that I showed much, much earlier. There was a meta-analysis of all areas of the brain across all creativity tasks. So what's really particular about this particular image is that there's activation both in a default mode network and the executive control network happening pretty much in the course of creative ideation for several seconds. Okay? But what's really more interesting is to look at the time course of activation. Okay, so if you remember before, I mentioned that in the second phase of studies, which is what I call Act 2, there was kind of a two-step process. So in the first phase, you had the default mode network kick in, and the person is generating ideas. In the second phase, the executive control network kicks in. You're evaluating what you've done. This is exactly what you see here. So what you see at the bottom, the number on the axis 2, 4, 6, 8, those are in seconds. This corresponds to the time course of a divergent thinking trial. So the person is, for example, given the term umbrella and asked to come up with creative ideas for an umbrella. So as the time course proceeds, the activation starts in a default mode network and then switches over to the executive control network at the back end of the trial. Okay? You have a very nice pattern of connectivity. Okay, but the question now is, okay, so it's great that these two systems are correlated together, but what's really driving the system? In other words, a lot of the early work that we could do in creativity, essentially by nature of fMRI analysis, is completely correlational in nature. So we're showing correlations between systems during creative activation. But at the systems level, is there any way we can actually test causal hypotheses? And now we can. So using a really nice method called dynamic causal modeling, what you can do now is using control theory, you can actually test causal hypotheses at the level of brain function. So what you can do is you can create models like you would do in any other area of psychology, and you can go into the brain data to see using Bayesian analysis whether the results are more or less consistent with one model versus the other. Okay? And the two models that we tested were the following. In what I've called model 1, which is what you see up top, the way it works is the default mode network kicks in, the person is generating ideas, then the executive control network controls what's happening in the default mode network before a response is generated. So you engage in ideation first, then you do evaluation, and then you generate a response. Okay? Model number 2 is an iterative system where you come up with an idea, you evaluate how good it is. If it's not good, you go back and you refine it until a final output comes out. And there's been a lot of work in the creativity literature trying to understand whether when people are generating novel ideas that are also useful, whether you go through a two-step process or whether you work at it before you put out the response. Okay? So we had people go into the fMRI scanner, we gave them a divergent thinking task, we created these two models, and then we fed our fMRI data into it to see whether the results that we have at the level of the brain are consistent with one model versus the other. And this is how the results look like. So the bar that you see is the probability of one model being correct. And as you can see, model 1 clearly wins out. Okay? There's really no need to do a statistical analysis here. It's just a Bayesian analysis. So in other words, it looks like, if you look at the brain function data, that what we're essentially going through is a single-step model. So it's our classic blind variation selective retention model, which really goes back many, many decades now. In other words, in the first phase, the person generates ideas. Then in the second phase, you evaluate those ideas, and you have an output. Doesn't seem to be an iterative function at the level of the brain. So overall conclusion, there are both controlled and associative processes during creative cognition. The default mode network is involved in associations, and the executive control network is involved in evaluation. We tend to go through a two-step process where we generate first and evaluate next, and we don't really tend to iterate. At least the brain data don't really support that model. And there's been a couple of very, very cool studies that came out in the last 12 months or so, where a very similar types of tasks were given to people that are true experts in their field, and they were compared to a smart control condition to see whether the regions that are involved in creativity really differ between big C creatives and little c creatives. And as it so happens, they don't. Okay? So the regions of the brain that are involved in coming up with uses that are both novel and useful responses are the same. The only difference being that in people that are at the high C level, they rely less on them than people who are in the low C condition. And I'll tell you why if you ask me about it. Okay? Very good question. Yeah, I've become really good at preempting these things. Okay, so the answer is this. So there's a lot of data from the intelligence work where you have people going to the fMRI scanner, and so you have people outside of the fMRI scanner that are given IQ tasks. Okay, then you distinguish between people who are high IQ versus low IQ. Okay, then people are going into the fMRI scanner, and you give them really different matrix reasoning tasks. Okay, and what you find is that people who are really high in intelligence recruit a very small number of brain regions strategically for solving the task, whereas people who are low in intelligence or creativity tend to recruit the entire brain. Okay, so the idea there is that people who are high in intelligence or creativity are neurally more efficient. They're better at strategizing, and they're recruiting exactly what they need to. But what's really hopeful about this data is, what if a person who is initially low in intelligence trains on the task over time? So of course, as their performance increases, the regions that are involved become smaller and smaller and smaller. So post-training, the neural signature for a person who was initially in a low IQ condition comes to resemble a person who was high IQ pre-training. In other words, there is hope for us all. Okay? Thank you very much. This is very helpful. Yeah. Oh, great.
Nos ha dejado sin aliento, ¿no? Qué rápido. Qué información
Okay, we're
interesante.
just
Vamos con las preguntas.
breathless now. Now we have the questions. We probably have to wait
Se
for
han
the speakers
maridado el uno con el otro.
to have their headsets so they can get the questions.
Don't be too judgmental.
Okay. No seáis muy duros conmigo, por favor. Okay, are you
Bueno,
ready?
vamos,
Can you hear me?
mientras se va poniendo el pinganillo,
While
vamos
he
a
is
leer aquello que
now
habéis
we're
ido
going to
preguntando.
read
Como os hemos
what you
dicho
have
antes, si no
been
da tiempo a responder a
asking.
vuestras
As we
preguntas,
said, if we don't have time
y
to
tenéis muchísimo
respond to your
interés, a
questions
través
and
de
you are very interested through
creatividad@centrobotin.org
Creatividad
nos las mandáis,
at
se las haremos llegar y irán contestando poco a poco.
centrobotin.org. You can send them and we will answer them
No,
back.
.org.
ORG, yes.
Centrobotin.org.
Okay.
A ver,
So the question, Pablo,
for you.
Pablo Tinio, this is for you.
Pablo Tinio nos decía que
Pablo
los museos
said
deben
that
trabajar
museums
más en
should
acercar el arte
work
al
more
público.
in
¿Puedes
getting art
trasladarnos
closer
algunas
to the
sugerencias
audience.
o retos?
Can you convey challenges for the museums?
Ahora, repito.
Can you hear me now? I can repeat the
Pablo
question.
Tinio nos decía que los
Pablo
museos
said
deben
that
trabajar
museums
más en
should
acercar el arte
work
al
more
público.
in getting
¿Puedes
art
trasladarnos
closer to
alguna
the audience.
sugerencia o
Can you
retos?
give us some suggestions or some challenges for the museums?
Channel 1.
Channel 1?
Yeah, maybe. Okay, Pablo, can you hear me
Perfect.
now?
One more
okay.
time.
Okay, again. So you were saying that museums should work
algunas
more
sugerencias o
in
retos
getting the
para
art
que los
closer to
museos
the
trabajemos
audience?
los centros
Can
de
you
arte
convey
más
some
en
suggestions or
acercar el arte
challenges
al
for
público?
museums in getting art closer to the audience?
Okay, yes. So the question is, no, I'm kidding. To get the work closer to the audience, there's many things that you can do, actually. One of the things the interesting finding from the study that I showed, a few things. One is the longer people actually spend in the exhibition or looking at artwork, the more intense their emotions were. That was very surprising. And second, and museums kind of do these things already. Second is that when they read when you walk into a gallery, there's a description of what's going to be shown. And also when you look at an individual artwork, there's like a description of it. There is actually an effect from those two things. The more you read, the more intense your emotional reactions are. So if you remember those blobs, they're like the heat maps. They get hotter. They get even hotter and bigger when people read the information, and also when they spend more time in it. And the third thing is that the more they know about it, whatever they're looking at, the more engaged they are, and the stronger their emotional reactions are. So I guess the one thing or two things is present information that are relevant to them, and second, slow them down. I think slowing down the visitors, which is a challenge, right? So 27.2 seconds. And that's the average. And that data was actually swayed by one person sitting down in front of a painting. But they couldn't toss out that data, right? That one data point. In reality, the average, the median, the middle time was about 15 seconds. So 27.2 was from one person. Okay, so slow them down, but it's hard. But there are other strategies that we can talk about some other time.
Okay, thank you. Al hilo de esto que estábamos contando, mañana vais a vivir, a partir de mañana...
In relation to this, from tomorrow you will have some activities that we are not going to tell you today, so they are a surprise. Ori, the question is for you. If creativity is in the brain, do you think in the genetic component of creativity?
So I think you meant if there is a genetic component to creativity.
El componente genético de la creatividad, sí.
¿Crees en el componente genético de la creatividad?
Yes.
Oh, is that the question?
Yes.
Yes, there is. Yeah. So there have been some very nice studies looking at both behavior genetic studies and allelic association studies to see whether there's any kind of genetic contribution to creativity, and both of those methods have shown that there is.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Thank you.
Do we have time for one more question? What is the role? What is the role of language determination in addition to emotions? The question is for Pablo Tinio. I repeat, what is the role of language in aesthetics or conceptual determination in addition to emotions? So what's the role of language, basically?
I didn't get that question, actually. Is it language?
Yes.
The world of language?
The
role of language and emotion. I mean, I guess you can answer that several ways. I can interpret that question several ways. Certainly the role of language. The role of, let me go back. The role of the visual sort of perception is one thing. But when you go to a museum, it's not necessarily just the visual perception, right? There were museums in the past that they actually did not write labels or present any additional information because of the fact that they wanted people to have very specific reactions, personal reactions. You can sway people's thinking and their aesthetic experience depending on how you present information. There's a lot of studies on this actually, where you would change the label. You would give just the title, right? Or you can have a simple description describing, let's say, a painting. You can also get really complex and talk about the artist's life. You can also talk about the curators and art historians' interpretation of the artwork. So yeah, language is massive as far as how we can mediate that aesthetic experience in not just a museum, but anywhere that art's presented. I hope that answers the question.
Espero que esto ha respondido a la pregunta.
One more. Again for you.
Okay.
For you, if the audience are not living an aesthetic experience, would you say that the artistic hasn't been successful in having a conversation with the audience? So if the audience is not living an aesthetic experience, would you say that the artist was unsuccessful?
Well, that's a danger. No, not at all. Not at all, because again, when we do studies like this, it's on average, right? And as scientists, we kind of want to talk about what most people say and what most people think and what most people feel. Even in the study that we've done, studies that we've done, there are some folks who report no emotion, right? But you have to take that with a grain of salt and really be careful with that interpretation, because some people just cannot report, cannot speak about and verbalize what they're feeling, right? And in the past, we did studies that way. They would look at an artwork, or we would present an artwork, and we'd ask them, how did this make you feel? That's really hard for folks. First of all, they have to kind of think about what emotion is this, right? And second, how strong is that emotion? So the way we did it is that you just have to pick. It doesn't require you to actively think about. We present to you the options. If you pick no emotion, that doesn't say that you felt no emotion. It certainly has nothing to do with the success of the artwork. Because, I mean, I don't know about you, but how many times did you walk into a museum, take a nod in an artwork, walk past it, right, and never come back? It's just that didn't do anything for you, but it might do it for some other person.
Thank you. ¿Más? ¿O sí? ¿Una más? Venga. This is in English. Can you read it?
La pregunta está en inglés.
Perfect.
La vamos a traducir. Dentro de la
Is that from you?
perspectiva del estudio del artista, ¿qué sucede cuando, por ejemplo, como en el caso de los minimalistas en los años 60, el proceso se presenta como la propia obra de arte? ¿No cree que la experiencia estética empieza en fases más
No, it still
tempranas?
doesn't change. I mean, because of the fact that I think it's very human. It's actually a visual perception thing. When we look at a table, for example, we look at the edges first, right? We determine it to be a table based on there's 4 legs, and then there's a flat surface. So artworks kind of work the same way. It's essentially just any other object. And what really makes it an artwork is that you do try to interpret it. So if it's a minimalist piece, let's say it's just a blue, right? Or a black canvas, like completely without any objects. That process of thinking, wow, what is that? Why is this in the museum? Or Jackson Pollock, a common saying is that, my kid can do that, right? Splash the paint. But that's not the point of thinking about aesthetic experience, is that it's going deep into that engagement and really thinking about, I wonder what the artist is trying to do here. So my answer is no, you do not skip the stages, because an artwork is fundamentally like just any other object. What makes it special is what happens in the end, and how we evaluate and interpret and think about it.
Okay. ¿Una pregunta? Micrófono, por favor.
We have a question.
Ya está mal decirlo, pero no me funciona la pregunta de la aplicación.
The application does not work. I'm sorry. I have to admit it.
Hay que salir de la aplicación y
Yes, you have to. When that happens, you have to go out of the application and then come back again. Oshin.
Solo por
Just,
insistir y clarificar,
for
se habla
insisting and
siempre de la
clarifying.
creatividad en
We
el
always
hemisferio
talk
derecho
about
y la lógica
creativity
en
at
el
the
hemisferio
right
izquierdo.
lobe and logic at the left
¿Qué nos
lobe.
explicas?
How can you say about it?
Your question, even though did you ask about the interplay between the hemispheres and right versus left, or logical versus intuitive? I don't really need this for that.
You are Spanish. You are Spanish.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the most fundamental questions in the field, and I think a lot of the work that first started about 20 years ago, I think a lot of us went in thinking that we would find centers of creative cognition in the right hemisphere. Okay, but if you look at the overall results now, it looks like it's actually very evenly distributed between both hemispheres. It is true that if you have lesions to the left hemisphere, you're more going to be involved in logical reasoning tasks, but there's a very strong logical contribution to creativity, which is where I think it kicks in.
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.